Hi, my name is Trisha Butler, and I'm a grad student with American Military University. This is a presentation on capital punishment for my public policy course. On this title slide, I've included a quote from Albert Pierrepoint, who was Britain's last executioner. He said, I have come to the conclusion that executions solve nothing and are only an antiquated relic of a primitive desire for revenge, which takes the easy way and hands over the responsibility for revenge to other people. The topic of this presentation analyzes the institutionalized killing of convicted criminals. Capital punishment, more commonly known as the death penalty, is state-imposed murder of criminals convicted of the most heinous crimes. Per the Death Penalty Information Center, Missouri is one of the 23 states that still applies capital punishment. The last execution in the state occurred on September 24th, 2024. The image on this slide is of the man who was executed on the 24th of September last year. His name was Marcellus Williams. Capital punishment was recently brought to public attention by President Trump, who issued an executive order titled Restoring the Death Penalty and Protecting Public Safety, his first day back in office. The topic is contextually important to the state of Missouri, particularly due to the lack of physical evidence in the aforementioned Marcellus Williams case. Williams' execution was hotly protested and is indicative of multiple issues with the death penalty, like racial discrimination and the probability of executing someone who is innocent. In addition to the impossibility of certain guilt in most cases, problems with the implementation of the policy include discrimination based on social, economic, and racial motivators. Existing literature also revealed a trend among those charged with executions. They believe the punishment is often poorly implemented. There also exists consternation as to whether a humane way to kill even exists. For instance, the most common method, lethal injection, cannot be administered by medical professionals because they're bound by the Hippocratic Oath. Thus, the procedures are sometimes botched, for lack of a better term. You should note that the graphic on this slide points out that Black people have a far higher odds of experiencing a botched execution. One of the most prevalent justifications for the death penalty is that it is a formidable deterrent. A plethora of literature and statistics suggests otherwise. Many states have specifically cited cost versus effectiveness as their reason for abolishing the practice, such as Maryland and New Jersey. Arguments have also long been made that life in prison is more effective than the relief of death. Perhaps most compelling, however, is that execution does not provide the justice or closure expected. Rather, it creates even more victims. There is not much that is efficient about the implementation, administration, adjudication, or execution of the capital punishment policy. Many factors in this analysis overlap. The policy's evaluation in areas such as effectiveness and cost are also germane to efficiency. Observance of the death penalty requires extended court time for appeals in particular. Like effectiveness, many states have admitted that the cost and time associated with the death penalty diverts funds and efforts from other areas of necessity. Overall, the justice system is commonly known for issues with corruption and unfairness, especially in regard to class and race. Systemic issues stem from our country's checkered past. The historical practice of lynching is synonymous with the modern idea of the death penalty. This is not to suggest the American court system is wholly untrustworthy or unreliable, rather that institutions populated with individuals are perpetually prone to corruption, emotion, and bias. For a more sterile angle, marry the ineffectiveness and inefficiency of this policy, taxpayers are not well served and do not benefit from it. Ethical and moral questions are the crux of public argument over the institution of capital punishment. This slide is dominated by a graphic displaying Pew polling data from 2021. The data shows a slim majority of Americans in support of the death penalty for murderers. More importantly, it shows that the public is also exceptionally aware that execution of innocents is possible and that racial disparity occurs. Nonetheless, the public still views state-sanctioned killing as moral. A joint study between St. Louis University and YouGov asked Missouri voters if they favored the death penalty in first-degree murder convictions. 62% said yes. Of the same group, 86% of Republicans answered yes. Considering that polling, it stands to reason that political feasibility of the policy is high, particularly since GOP officials hold an overwhelming majority of elected positions. Administrative feasibility is another thing. As was noted before, funding is a consistent issue. That is likely why Trump immediately offered federal assistance with his executive order. Technical feasibility issues were also mentioned in previous slides, and they still persist. As was elucidated in the previous slide and the Pew data slide, Americans support the death penalty. Missourians are a few points higher in favorability of the policy. The chart on this slide is another from the aforementioned joint study. The same group was asked, should the governor be allowed to change death penalty sentences to life in prison without parole? The same group polled only 52% in favor of such an action, with Republican support dropping by half. It would seem that Missourians do not consider life sentences as effective as death. The bulk of long-term consequences for capital murder are far too nuanced for this presentation, but perhaps the most resounding one is the fact that further victimization occurs. The family of the victim and death row inmate, plus those involved in the prosecution, defense, and administration of the punishment, must all be considered. Further, earlier noted concerns about funding and manpower have future implications with the persistence of the policy. The impact of capital murder on society as a whole is a net negative because of these outcomes and its lack of effectiveness. Lastly, technology is continually advancing and has already exonerated some who have been killed. This cannot be overlooked. Of course, the most serious and tragic consequence of the death penalty is the murder of someone who was not guilty of the crime. The injustice levied on those who have been exonerated from death row is another. Deterioration of current death row inmates due to uncertainty and prolonged isolation is often underestimated. But perhaps the most overlooked unintended consequence is the effect on the victim's family, who may be forced to relive a tragedy because of the appeals intrinsic to a death sentence. It's important to point out the graphic on this slide as well. It covers the amount of time the 200 individuals who have been exonerated spent in prison. The average is 13 years, but collectively they served 2,621 years. Notwithstanding the individual and societal cost of capital punishment, legitimate financial costs must also be evaluated. It is widely believed that state-sanctioned killing saves taxpayer dollars. This could not be farther from the truth. Life imprisonment is more fiscally conservative than administering the death penalty. Data specific to the cost of the policy in Missouri is not readily available because a full cost analysis has never been conducted, nor has the topic been officially studied. Various reports from many organizations are available for other states. Those reports were sourced from Amnesty International for this project. The displayed graphic is an older one. It's from 2015, but the specific crime designation identified is in line with Missouri's requirement for the death penalty. It provides a general idea, not of the precise cost, but of the cost differentiation. Because the state of Missouri has never studied the financials of capital punishment, it is difficult to ascertain maintainability. Since Trump decided and specified Missouri as a state in need of aid, one might assume such. But the president's track record isn't exactly reliable. For the sake of this analysis, we will assume that the state's deficit and financial challenges cannot, or at least should not, maintain a policy that is ineffective and a net fiscal drain. The included graphic, however, is a more optimistic outlook. This research shows that the state of Missouri is not up to date on reevaluation of the longstanding policy of capital punishment. The lack of fiscal data is not promising. Further, and much more importantly, the recent execution of a man in a case that did not include physical evidence is shocking. That the convicted and executed man was Black adds a layer of suspicion and skepticism to his case and the death penalty in Missouri. Conversely, it is worthwhile to note that the requirements for a death sentence in the state are limited. But that does not do anything to assuage distrust if a person can be found guilty beyond a shadow of a doubt and subsequently put to death in the absence of physical evidence. Worse yet, the man who prosecuted Marcellus Williams pleaded with the judge to stay the execution, as DNA evidence had surfaced that may have exonerated him. But there's still more. The victim's family also pled for clemency from the governor, who did not respond. Given this miscarriage of justice, the state's dereliction and reexamination of a 215-year-old law, and the well-documented ineffectiveness and inefficiency of capital murder, the conclusion of this research is that the policy should be abolished without prejudice. But that's a recommendation for the next slide. The Missouri legislature should pass HB 994. It's a House bill that's been introduced and is about to go through a second reading. It would abolish the death penalty and commute death row inmates' sentences to life sentences without parole. In the event that that legislation should fail, the state should immediately and completely re-examine the capital punishment policy to include a full fiscal impact analysis, comprehensive study on the rate of botched and exonerated executions, as well as an analysis of the effectiveness of the policy as a deterrent and mechanism for increased justice and public good. After the proliferation of the results, a large-scale polling or ballot initiative should be launched to gauge public opinion. Of course, it's preferable if the State House would simply codify HB 994. The last two slides are a plethora of resources that were used to conduct this study. Thank you very much for listening.